Since Paul had broken up with Clara, the house seemed frozen in a dull melancholy. Once full of life and laughter, it had become a silent space, inhabited by a vague sadness. Their breakup hadn't come as a surprise. I had seen the gradual distance, the rare exchanges, the averted gazes, and the growing weariness that marked Paul's features. Despite these warning signs, nothing had prepared us for the deep pain that settled within him. Paul had always been very sensitive. Since childhood he had felt things with rare intensity, wearing his emotions on his sleeve. I had seen him that evening, come home with a closed face, reddened eyes, and without a word collapse onto the couch. He seemed to want to disappear, to shrink as if to escape the grief that overwhelmed him. Sitting next to him I felt his pain almost as much as he did, torn between wanting to comfort him and needing to give him the space he required. The following days were marked by a heavy silence. Paul wandered through the house like a ghost, his gaze lost, his energy gone. He spent long hours locked in his room, the door slightly ajar as a fragile compromise between his need for isolation and his unconscious desire for comforting presence. One evening, as I found him sitting in front of a barely touched plate, I tried to start a conversation. He looked at me tired and murmured, "I thought we had a future together." His words echoed in me, a testimony to a love he believed unshakable, now reduced to mere memories. I sat next to him, feeling his grief weigh heavily in the air. I wished I could reach out, embrace him like I used to when a scrape on his knee seemed like the worst of injuries. But I knew that with time, some pains couldn't be soothed by a simple hug. He had to go through them at his own pace, feeling each jagged edge before he could hope to overcome them. The television played some random show, but neither he nor I were really watching it. "I'm sorry, Paul," I finally whispered. He nodded silently, a single tear slipping down his cheek before he wiped it away with a quick gesture. It was hard to see him like this, broken, bearing the weight of a story that had unraveled despite him. The following days passed in strange muteness. He lingered around the house, silent, retreating to his room with the door left slightly ajar, a symbol of his internal struggle between isolation and the need for comfort. I respected this space, even though it tore me apart to see him slowly distancing himself from everything around him. One evening, while I was preparing tea, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, his gaze fixed on the cup in his hands. I sat across from him, hoping he might open up even just a little. "Sometimes I wonder if I could have done things differently," he murmured. I swallowed hard, searching for the right words, the ones that could ease a pain that only time and patience could truly lessen. I let the silence settle, a silence filled with everything he couldn't express. The ticking of the clock resonated in the room, marking the waiting, and I wondered how long it would take before he would break the invisible barrier between us. I glanced at him from the corner of my eye, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers nervously intertwined, perhaps seeking an anchor in this inner turmoil. "Do you want to talk about it?" I finally asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He shrugged, a long, weary sigh escaping his lips. "There's not much to say," he whispered, his gaze lost somewhere between the table and the void. But I knew that behind these words lay a storm of regrets and unanswered questions. The days that followed were marked by his silences and absences, even when he was physically present. He wandered through the house like a shadow, dragging his feet, avoiding my gaze. Sometimes he would stop in front of the window, gazing at the garden with an expression that clenched my heart, a mix of nostalgia and uncertainty about the future. One morning I found him sitting in the living room, absently flipping through an old book he had loved as a child. It was a small victory, a timid step toward something familiar, maybe even reassuring. I took a quiet breath and sat across from him, hoping that little by little he would find himself again, that he would accept that some wounds take time to heal. I respected his need for solitude even though it weighed on me. Every day I watched for any sign of improvement, a fleeting smile, a sigh less heavy, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. But Paul remained frozen in his grief. as if the simple act of moving might break whatever little strength he had left. Often, I would find him sitting in the kitchen, his gaze lost in the void, a cup of coffee cooling between his hands. Sometimes he would retreat to his room, the door half closed, an invisible barrier I dared not cross. At night, the light would filter faintly under his door, proof that he spent long hours awake, alone with his thoughts. One afternoon as I was tidying the living room, I finally heard him murmur something. "I miss her, you know." His voice was trembling, almost broken. I froze, surprised by this confession ripped from the silence. I approached him gently and sat next to him, placing a light hand on his arm. "It's normal, Paul. When you really love someone, their absence leaves a void. But you're not alone." He nodded, not looking at me, his gaze fixed on some invisible point ahead of him. It was a small step, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. I knew then that he would eventually make it through at his own pace, in his own way. Paul didn't look up, absent-mindedly playing with the crumbs scattered across the table. I took a sip of tea, letting the silence settle between us, a silence that, though heavy, felt necessary. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked finally in a soft, almost hesitant voice. He shrugged slightly, a tiny, barely perceptible gesture. Then after a long pause he sighed. "I don't know what to say. Everything feels empty," he murmured, his voice raspy. I felt my heart tighten. "It's normal. You've lost something important. Someone important." He nodded slowly, his fingers tracing invisible circles on the table. "I thought we'd make it, that we'd always find our way back to each other." I didn't know what to say. Sometimes the silent promises we make to each other don't withstand the wear of time. I simply placed a comforting hand on his. He finally looked up at me, a mix of fatigue and gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you for being here." I gave him a sad smile. "Always, Paul." We stayed there, sharing a fragile moment where words no longer really mattered. That day, for the first time in a long while, I felt a tiny ray of light piercing through the grayness of his heart. Days went by and I noticed small changes in his behavior. He was getting up a bit earlier, taking the time to have breakfast with me, and sometimes he would watch television without really following it, lost in his thoughts. I knew he was trying to regain his footing, but Clara's shadow still lingered in every corner of the house. One evening as we sat in the living room, he broke the silence. "Do you think you can really forget someone you loved?" His voice was soft, almost childlike. I took a breath. "I don't know if you forget, Paul. But you learn to live with it." He nodded slowly as if weighing my words. "I don't think I know how to do that. No one really knows. It takes time." He gave a sad smile. "Time? Everyone tells me that, but it's like every day lasts an eternity." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I picked up a photo from the coffee table, one of him and Clara, happy and carefree. "Maybe for now you don't need to forget. Just accept." Paul stared at the photo for a long moment before gently setting it down. "Do you think I'll make it?" "I'm sure of it." He sighed, a little less burdened this time. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And sometimes a start is all you need. Sitting on a bench, Paul absent-mindedly watched an elderly couple feeding the pigeons. He let out a sigh, one that carried more weight than he probably wanted to admit. "Do you think they've been together for a long time?" he asked in a quiet voice. I followed his gaze and shrugged. "Probably. Some loves last a lifetime." He gave a joyless smile. "And some don't." I didn't respond, letting the silence give him the space he needed. After a moment he continued. "Claire loved this park. We came here a lot." His fingers nervously played with the fabric of his jacket. "I wonder if she still comes here, without me." I placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Maybe. But that doesn't mean your memories here have to disappear. They're yours too." He nodded slowly, his gaze lost in the tree-lined paths. "I stuck. Like I can't move forward, you know? It's normal, Paul. It takes time to find yourself again after a breakup." He nodded, then after a long silence stood up. "Let's walk a little more." I stifled a smile. It wasn't much, but it was a step. A step toward something else. Toward acceptance, maybe. Days passed, and little by little, Paul started to regain his habits, timidly at first, as if rediscovering his own life. One morning I caught him preparing coffee, his gaze lost in the slow dance of steam rising from the cup. "I should probably start drawing again," he said suddenly without looking at me. I smiled, relieved to hear a glimmer of hope in his voice. "That's a good idea. You were good, you know." He shrugged, absent-mindedly playing with the spoon. "Clara used to say that too." His smile was sad, but it was there. It was the beginning. Later that day I found him in the living room, a sketchbook on his lap, his pencil hesitating on the blank page. I sat quietly beside him, watching as he traced timid lines that slowly began to take shape. He didn't say anything, but I felt a tension gently fading in the air. "It's been a while," he finally murmured. I nodded. Sometimes going back to what we truly love is the best way to move forward. He gave a faint smile. Maybe. Each sketch, each line seemed to help him reconnect with a bit of himself. I knew not everything was fixed, that the road ahead would still be long, but seeing Paul rekindle his passions gave me a small sense of hope. And for the first time in weeks, I truly believed he was going to make it.